Okay, so I think we're ready to start. Thank you, Leah. So good morning, bon matin, everyone. You're very, very welcome to this France-Ireland Chamber of Commerce event. I'd like to welcome all our members and their guests on behalf of the Chamber and also our partner for this webinar, which is CPL. And CPL is one of our most recently appointed patrons of the France-Ireland Chamber of Commerce. We're going to talk today about the future of work, the next collaborative advantage. Again, this is another very timely topic as we plan our way out of the various lockdowns we have been through, and we see the light at the end of the tunnel, and we look to opening offices and meeting people in groups again. Just before we continue and I introduce you to our speaker, I'd just like to say that we will have an opportunity to pose questions with our expert today. So I'd ask you to use the chat button that you can see at the bottom of your screen and write in the questions there, and we will come to them towards the end of the presentation. So moving on to our speaker today, who is called Barry Winkless. Barry, you're very welcome. Barry is CSO of CPL and head of the Future of Work Institute. And he is a thought leader in strategic design, innovation and engagement, with a particular focus on how society is changing and what that means to the world of the work. Over the past 23 years, Barry has worked globally with some of the world's most respected organizations. He is a frequent author and speaker at numerous client and external events. His key topics include the future of work and society, creativity and creative leadership, designing employee and client experiences, technology foresight, immersive storytelling, and new operating models. Barry also heads up the Future of Work Institute, which is part of CPL, and it's in a way like a think tank looking to the future of work. It's a multidisciplinary team working globally to question, explore, and design future work solutions with organizations. So he isn't just a speaker, but he is pushing the frontiers on the future of work on a day-to-day basis. And finally, if that is not enough achievement, you also are publishing a book this year called The Future of Work, a guide for leaders, will be published in 2021. So Barry, I think that introduces you, and I will pass over to you to present to us on the future of work, the next collaborative advantage. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Cliona. Hi, how are you, everybody? It's really nice to be here. And Cliona, thank you very much for inviting me along. I will have to use some slides due to the nature, or the virtual nature, shall we say, of presentations these days. So I'm just going to flick onto my screen, and hopefully you will all be able to see. I'm about to share. Cliona, you might see if everybody can see that, hopefully.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, is that okay? Great.
Fine.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thank you very much. So look, as Cliona mentioned, I head up this thing called the Future of Work Institute. It's also a little bit embarrassing, I suppose, to be introduced because you kind of fall somewhere between being humble and being highly egotistical. But I think from a very practical perspective, me and my team are working on research, on pilots, and on projects in this whole area called the future of work. And specifically, I want to kind of talk a little bit about this idea of collaboration over the next kind of 10 years, because there are a lot of changes happening. A lot of focus around the future of work has been obviously due to the COVID crisis that we're all trying desperately to deal with in our various organizations. But actually, a number of big changes have been kind of bubbling under the surface, maybe over the last 10 to 15 years, based on our own research. So when we ask people, and this is maybe about 150 leaders around, what changes are going to happen as a result of the future of work? Generally, people have this idea that it's going to be significant, or very significant in some shape or form. And then you ask the next question, and you say, well, what do you mean by the future of work? And by and large, what we find is that different people have different perspectives on the future of work. From a very practical perspective, I found that there are a lot of the focus on the future of work, as you would imagine, is around this whole thing around flexibility and hybrid working. That's only actually one small part of the future of work. So the first thing I suppose I'd like you to furnish with you today is our definition of the future of work. And we see it as the evolution and integrated design of workplaces, workforces, and work tasks across multiple time horizons in the context of business and society. So lots of big words there, but the most important words are design. So that's really important because I think first and foremost, as leaders, we have an ability to design our workplace, our workforces, and how we do tasks in the way that we want it to be. And I can tell you now, there are no one-size-fits-all solutions for organizations facing into the future of work. So that's the first important word in this definition. The other important words are what we call the 3 Ws, and I'm going to talk to you about those in a moment. And then the other element is this idea of time and society. So all of these things are bubbling around this idea of the future of work, and these are the kind of things that we need to understand. So the second thing I'd like to furnish you with is this idea of the 3 Ws of the future of work. And those 3 Ws, and we call this the future of work world, we want to call it that, is workplace. So this is where work gets done, and that can be across physical, digital, or virtual spaces. Right? So it can be any combination of those things. Workforce, this is how our workforces are designed, how they're managed, and how they're motivated. And then the third W is the work task. So these are the methods, the tools, the mindsets that actually deliver the work. And as I said, a lot of the commentary and a lot of the discussions around the future of work have actually focused in on this idea of the workplace. You know, do we need to work from home? Do we need to, you know, can we work virtually? Can we have mix and matches of all this kind of thing? Generally, our research is showing that most organizations, outside of about 1 to 2%, are moving more towards a hybrid type working model where there's a level of formalized flexibility within that organization. But for us just to focus on the workplace is actually to miss an opportunity to think holistically about this idea of the future of work. And I would argue that things like workforce and work tasks are equally, if not more important on this idea of where we actually work in physical or in digital space. Now, I mentioned at the start in terms of the presentation that we talk about, when we talk about the future of work, we talk about it through the context of society, if you want to call it the context of this particular zeitgeist of how we think about things. And if you can imagine, most organizations up until about maybe 10, 15 years ago, this would look like their genetic strand, if you want to call it that. And these colors would represent, you know, the different mindsets within an organization. And by and large, up and again, 15 years ago, it will be very much focused on what I would call the blue and orange colors, very much focused on putting processes in place, standardization, competition, playing to win, very much a focus on hierarchy and putting structures in place so we can actually manage and control. And over to the kind of right, we had some organizations starting to think a little bit more broadly in terms of work and thinking about things like community and the environment. Things like, you know, how do we actually help people create more meaning in their work? But it was very, very, very small. If we kind of fast forward to today, and I should say that these changes were happening well in advance of the COVID crisis. There was a changing zeitgeist in terms of how we view work. The kind of DNA strand, the genetic strand looks a little bit like this today. So there's definitely a shifting mindset where we're expanding our focus on things like community, on equality, on the environment. But also we're starting to see kind of words like regeneration popping up. You know, how can we have an organization that continuously regenerates itself, right? How can we think about enabling our employees, the people that work with us, to bring their whole selves to work? These are all of these kind of phrases that we're starting to see, particularly over the last 5 to 7 years. Now, regardless of what your thoughts are on any of these concepts, and you know, sometimes I kind of veer between, is this all bump or is it reality? You know, from our own research and the work that we're doing, we are starting to see very clearly this kind of shift in mindset. And probably the most visible one is this, what I would call enforced focus really on the environment, on the ESG, you know, type standards, right, where we need to be much more focused on sustainability as a business. But that's only one of a number of different things that we're kind of starting to see happening in the workplace. And, you know, as with all things, there have been pockets of the future around for the last number of years, and we're starting to see those pockets, shall we say, increase into the future. And I just want to kind of call out one particular example. I really love music, and I like all types of music. I really like classical music, and back in the day, I listened to an orchestra called Orpheus, and that was an orchestra set up in about 1971, 72. It was a kind of a concert orchestra, chamber orchestra, and I didn't realize at the time, but it was the first orchestra that didn't have any conductor. For any of you that know anything about classical music, having no conductor is basically the same as having no CEO. It was set up by a gentleman called Julian Pfeiffer over in the States. And that was really, really interesting about that is it represents in many ways one form of the new type of organizations that have been kind of creeping up over a period of time. And if we look at the Orpheus, future work map, we see that on one hand, they don't have a conductor, right? So from actually getting things done, they don't have a conductor. They have a rotational concertmaster. So everybody in the team at some point will, manage, a piece in some shape or form. It's very much self-managing, in terms of how it actually manages. And we're starting to see more and more elements of self-management be brought into organizations in terms of how things get done. If we think about in terms of the overall workforce, membership ultimately is dictated by all the musicians. So it's very much a democratic process. When we talk about this idea of workplace, they basically use rented places and to work from home, when practicing their pieces. So it's an example of an organization from a totally different sector that have trialed, new ways of working over the last 45 years. And I should say that, the Orpheus Chamber Orchestra we probably consider one of the best in the world. So obviously having some kind of a positive impact. Now, if we look at things like then the impact of technology, that's also bringing us all sorts of really interesting types of organizations. And I don't know how many of you know about Quirky, but this is an online design platform where they tap into the crowd. So i.e. everyone is part of the potential workforce of Quirky. And those people can then submit ideas and a core set of designers can develop up those concepts are the ones that kind of make it to the top, and then potentially commercialize those ideas and then have a share in equity and a share in the profits. So, when people talk about technology, and particularly when we talk in terms of the future of work, it is having significant impacts in terms of the types of organizations that we can actually create, as opposed to just a set of technologies that enables us to automate particular tasks or increase efficiency of particular tasks. It's actually enabling totally new forms of organizations, and we're going to see more and more new types of organizations kind of morph into different directions and in different ways. So that's the most important thing at the moment, is to think now about the future of work through the lens of these 3 Ws. Now, from our research, we really see 3 kind of major flows towards, if we want to call it that, and let's just call it under the Moncure HDT. And what I mean by that is, first and foremost, we're starting to see organizations attempting to become more human. And now we hear a lot about organizations becoming more human, but we've gone a little bit deeper than that in our work and our research with over probably 100 organizations at this stage. And when we ask them, what do you actually mean by more human? What are we trying to get at here? And generally, this is what we think, right? These are the 7 things that we think more human is starting to mean in organizations and will mean probably for the next 7 to 10 years. So one is around flatter structures and greater empowerment. So we are starting to see a major focus on delayering of organizations, and that has happened in some organizations, some more successful than others. As with all models, they have positives and negatives to those things. So you will see, case studies of, examples where it's worked and others where it hasn't. Okay. This idea of deeper understanding of the overall human experience, we're starting to see more and more application of things like neuroscience and psychological research in the workplace, and that's going to continue as we try to really understand this idea of the human experience. I think this idea then of designing experience that actually matter to people in an organization. So, testing ourselves as organizations as to how many memories did we actually create for individuals in our organization, as opposed to, how did they hit their KPIs in whatever shape or form. This idea of an evolved approach to leadership, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation, so I'll leave that one there for the moment. And then this idea of a balance, increased inclusivity, authenticity in terms of how things work, going to be equally important. I think a really interesting one that's coming up all of the time now is this idea of demystifying technology. So we talk a lot about kind of giving people digital skills and upskilling them, but it's really the end goal is to demystify technology in a way that people can access technology. And I think the other thing that's very much in line with that is this debate around the ethical use of technology. So how much is too much? How much automation is right? You know, what's the Goldilocks zone, if we want to call it that, for technology that's not, you know, that's positively impactful on organizations and on people, but maybe not adversely negatively impactful. You want to call it too hot or too cold. And then this idea of personalization of the developmental journey. And, you know, this idea of, you know, kind of blanket type training and upskilling and development for people really is probably going to move into a thing of the past, and it's going to be very much around this idea of personalized journeys. So that's the H in our kind of a HDT equation. I think when it comes to the second element, more D, this is this idea of more design focused. And you know, some of you may be aware of things like design thinking and all these kind of good things, but really it's around having this much deeper design focus so that the things we're doing, number one, are more purposeful. Secondly, that we're attempting more to join the dots across the types of things that we're doing. So thinking more holistically. Story is the basis for everything. I talk a lot about this, and I always like to ask people, like, what is your actual future of work story? What is your future of work story across those 3 W's? What I find really interesting when I talk to a number of kind of C-suite executives is when I ask them the question around, well, you know, what is your future work story? Number one, they might not understand what that is, and then secondly, they'll say, well, you know, it's kind of it's not in control. We're not in control of it. It's probably more in control of us. So this idea of story is the basis of everything. This again concept of striving to make everything as inclusive and user-centered as possible is becoming really key in terms of organizations that are going to succeed into the future. And then this idea of designing for emotion and designing for feeling. We talk a lot about design for impact in terms of the bottom line, but we also need to think about design for emotion, you know, the types of emotions we're trying to design for, and what that actually might mean to our employees and also to our customers. And then the final kind of letter in our HDT equation is T, right? More technology, and this one is pretty obvious, but when we talk about what that actually means, you know, we are obviously talking about greater integration of technology and making it a little bit more frictionless. I'm sure you all personally have experiences where you have those moments where technology just doesn't seem to make sense to you or doesn't seem to work for whatever reason. I've had a number of those moments when I'm trying to deliver talks like this. So this idea of greater integration where greater systems can talk together and more of a friction-free approach to technology is something that we're seeing more and more of. We are starting to see an increase of automation, both in terms of front stage and backstage. And what do I mean by that? Well, you know, a lot of the tech and a lot of things like AI and machine learning, a lot of that is being applied what I would call quiet backstage, backstage areas that aren't necessarily massively visible, but are having major implications in terms of effectiveness and efficiency of core processes. And then we're starting to see more front stage kind of technologies in terms of, you know, interacting with smart bots and all this kind of good stuff. I think the other thing then, I'm not going to talk too much about the technology thing, but we are talking about a major increase in things like platforms, which is having a really impact in terms of things like what we mean by this thing called the workforce. What does that actually mean to that? We're starting to see this idea of the multiverse. So this idea of seamless interactions between the physical and the digital and the virtual. And I think we've only started really to scratch the surface on those areas in terms of how we can bring those different things together to create better engagement, you know, deeper levels of collaboration. We're starting to see the democratization of tools of work and play, and I'll talk again a little bit about that in a moment. And almost an infinite access to knowledge resources, which is really, really interesting. So if you really think about it, we can access something like 10 trillion times the amount of information that you could have in your local library back in the day. And for any of you guys who went through college or university, of a particular vintage, shall we say, I'm sure you'll have all experienced sitting in a library, working with librarians to try and get some obscure article references, which is now available probably at the touch of 2 or 3 buttons. So, you know, when we think about the future of work, we're thinking about the 3 W's. We're thinking about this idea of workplace, workforce, work task, and then we're talking about these kind of the HDT, right? More human, more design, and more technological focused. Now, I'm not going to talk about all of this model because it would take me a very, very long time, but I did mention at the very start of this presentation, or sorry, I should say, Cliona mentioned at the very start of this presentation, that I talk about this idea of the future of work as the next collaborative advantage. And if we think about these 3 Ws almost as sliders, right, that we can kind of think about where we're going to be in terms of our future of work design. And we think about the important sliders when it comes to the workforce. In our research, and again, we did a number of working sessions with large organizations, as we asked the question, you know, when we talk about some of these vectors in terms of the workforce element, where are we going to be over the next kind of 5 to 10 years? And there's 2 elements I'm going to focus in on. I'm not going to talk about everything on this slide. One is this concept of blend. So instead of owning all of our employees, we might be accessing a broader network. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that because I think it's really, really important in terms of how we think about this idea of the workforce and also collaboration. And then we think about this idea of structure, this movement from hierarchy to this idea of flat holacracy, this whole idea of much flatter systems to work with also has major implications in terms of how we view leadership over the next coming years. So I always like to put a little definition up here, more to remind myself, I should say, as opposed to anybody else, but you know, what the hell is collaboration? Well, it's actually the act of working with someone to produce something. And I actually think that one of the most important words for the future of work is this idea of with. And let me explain what I mean by that whilst I subtly take some water here. Our expectations of work has changed. We are in a very kind of interesting space in Europe and in most of the Western world, and also in many other parts of the world as well, where expectations for people have changed, and we're also moving to a totally different concept of what workforce actually means. If you can imagine that approximately 2035, and you know, years will differ in terms of some of the research, but in terms of our own research, by 2035, probably 30 to 35% of our workforce are going to be some type of freelancer. So really think about that, right? Over 30% of the workforce are going to be freelancer. What does that mean? That means that a number of those great talents that as organizations we want or we need are going to be working with us, not for us. And that's one of the reasons I say that with is probably the most important word for the future of work. And there's a number of reasons why this is happening. Number one is we have now a situation where we can create our own career journey. I know some of you, again, of a similar vintage to me, and even those who are younger than me will appreciate, you know, when you were at university, the first thing I remember my father saying to me is, okay, you've had your fun, you know, go out and get a job. Time to get a job. If you were lucky, you would find a good organization that would help, you know, develop your career and kind of, you know, move forward on that side. Then if you're really lucky, you would have really meaningful working experiences with a particular organization or not. And at that point you might say, well, you know, I think I might go and work for myself here because I would like to kind of create my own career journey. And this idea of moving into working on a portfolio of projects and a portfolio of organizations becomes really interesting because that then helps us almost to transform as individuals. So work as some type of transformative experience. Now, if you really kind of look at this broader, you know, societal thing that's happening at the moment around this idea of workforce, this is a fantastic picture, but this is a guy called James Hobson, who has an organization called Hacksmith. And basically what Hacksmith do is they seem to replicate you know, technologies in superhero and science fiction films. So that this photograph represents their attempt to create a real lightsaber from the Star Wars universe. But I think what's really, really interesting for me is that kind of James Hobson represents that kind of transformative individual that, because of access to new technologies, to audiences through platforms like YouTube, and through kind of really living their passions, they are representative of an individual being able to create their own journey, their own self-career, if you want to call it that. And imagine that James is representative over the next 10 years of, you know, 30 to 35% of this thing that we call workforce. We take another example. This is a film still of a short film called Astartes, which is again a science fiction film based on a world called Warhammer 40,000, for any of those that you're into this kind of stuff. It was developed by a gent called Simon Pedersen. And what's really interesting about this particular film was that this was made by one person using existing tools, existing technology tools that are already out there, either at low cost or no cost, to develop better films than the organization that owns Warhammer 40,000. And as a result, this organization is now working with this person on a new film. So again, that idea of width. And we ran our own experiment on this as well, where we said, well, you know, is actually, you know, is this a reality? Is this something that's easily accessible to an individual? And I went on my own 12-week journey of creating a virtual reality experience from no experience all the way to kind of creating some kind of a virtual film, if you want to call it that. And what I recognized were a number of things. I recognized that a number of the tools that I needed were very cheap or free. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing I learned was that there is a huge amount of knowledge, almost infinite resources, if we come back to my T in my equation, in terms of, you know, how I could actually learn from other people, and I could also tap into broad existing communities. And lo and behold, within 12 weeks, I managed to, you know, pull together a virtual reality story, which is actually based, believe it or not, on Prince, which is one of my musical icons, shall we say, and his conversation he had in the lift, unfortunately, which he passed away on. But it gave a great example of this thing that is happening and that is changing lots of things, right? And if you're to kind of put it all the way down, you know, into what all of this means, right? It means this, that we have this concept now of global micro niches. And what do I mean by that? It means that regardless of what we're into, regardless of what little skill set that we have, we can actually then tap into a global niche on platform. So if I've got a very, very specific skill set, but I might only be able to get 4 or 5 days of work on that, then I can do it globally. That means that's a new job for me. That's a new role. That's my self-career kind of worked on. And it's coupled up with this idea of long tail roles, right? So, you know, these concepts, things work on getting smaller and smaller, but because you can work on them at the global level, you can actually make a potential career of that. And it's also linking into this whole idea then of the unbundling of jobs. So as opposed to having a job, it's more around that jobs will unbundle, and there'll be different tasks that can be achieved by different types of experts and different types of people. Now, what I should say is this is all going alongside what I would say our current working model, okay? And that is really the interesting thing for me. On one hand, we've got the world that we've been used to for a very, very long time. And then this kind of new emerging world with all of its flaws and all of its challenges, but it's something really, really interesting in there. And we're seeing lots and lots and lots of platforms that are enabling individuals to interact with themselves and interact with other organizations for short-term work, for contract work, for, you know, project type work, for all sorts of stuff. Now, there's lots of debate around the good things and the bad things around platform type work and gig type work, etc., etc. And I'm not going to have that kind of debate today. There are absolutely good elements and bad elements to this, but fundamentally at its core, it is trying to solve the big polarity of security and freedom. Okay, and that's really at the core. So it's one of the biggest polarities of our age is how can we create a world that has and ticks the box on both security, right, and this idea of freedom. And I think that's the most interesting thing when we talk about this kind of self-career, these kind of platforms. So what does that mean to an organization? Well, it means to an organization that this actually is what our workforces actually look like today in terms of the types of organization work and how we're interacting with different types of business, right? This is actually what it looks like. It looks more like a network. It looks more like a network effect. And when people ask me around, you know, your workforce, well, like the next question I ask, well, do you actually understand what your workforce actually is? We have a tendency in organizations to focus with our core talent group. Let's call them our permanent employee group. And that's absolutely fine. But actually, that only generally represents a third of our overall working network in terms of how we actually can innovate, how we can collaborate, how we can create new things, how we can do all sorts of really, really interesting stuff. So when we talk about this idea of workforce, we're now having to think about new types of analogies. And I really love this piece of research. It's actually done probably 15, 16 years ago now by authors called Uzi and Spiro. And what they did was they looked at kind of, you know, the development of musicals. And they were trying to understand, you know, networks and this idea of, you know, what the kind of networks that are successful or kind of create the better, increase the probability of success of a particular musical. And what they found is that if you had lots of experienced people in the network, tendency it wouldn't work. And if you had lots of people who didn't have a lot of experience together, it wouldn't work. But actually the perfect combo was, you know, professional network, but with new blood linked into that network would actually increase the success of that particular show. And I think that's the really, really key thing for me at the moment, is that when we talk about workforce, these are the kind of things we need to start thinking about. These are the new analogies that we need to start thinking about when we think about this idea of workforce. Workforce is now more like a network. It's more like an organism. There's lots of research that, you know, highlights the impact of superorganisms, right, and how they can have an impact on all sorts of things, right? How they can adjust to their environment very quickly, how they can adjust to external changes very, very quickly. We also need to think about our workforce like community, right? We also need to think about our workforce as a broader crowd, right? That we can actually tap into everybody. And if you look at organizations like Lego and like General Electric, they're using the power of the crowd in many, many instances to develop new ideas, new concepts, okay? And then we go into lots of other types of areas. So, well, if it's a bit like that, then is it like a club? Is it like a membership club that we're part of as well? And the reality is it's all of these things. So as leaders in our organizations, we need to start really thinking about our workforce in a much, much broader context, because within that is the ability for us to create new collaborative advantages, to create all sorts of competitive advantages against our competitors and, you know, everything else that we kind of have to deal with in our world. I'm just going to kind of talk a little bit more just about leadership, because leadership comes up around, you know, how is it changing? You know, what's happening, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And I always like to kind of call out this gentleman first. I don't know if any of you know who this guy is, but his name is Ika Pannanen. And if any of you are Finnish, apologies for the poor pronunciation. But he is the CEO of an organization called Supercell. And he actually calls himself the world's least powerful CEO, which I think is an absolutely brilliant statement. But actually it represents the way that leadership is going. So Supercell itself is organized around the cell structure. So I mentioned this idea of organisms before as one type of analogy for the workforce. And the idea really is to create these self-managing cells that have full responsibility over, you know, the particular type of work. And we are starting to see an increase in leaders like this, and also an increase in this type of operating model. Now, I always like to kind of keep things relatively simple. So when we talk about leadership and this idea of the future of work, if I was to put it into one very simple kind of slide, this for me is at the key. You think about it on the left-hand side, you know, it's all about the leader making decisions, okay? And then there's a spectrum all the way over to the employee, where ultimately our employees or our network make the decision. So really when we talk about leadership in terms of the future of work, I think the first question we need to ask ourselves is, where is the right place to land on this spectrum that works for our organization and actually works in terms of the flow of this idea of the future of work? Now, there is no doubt that the flow, if you want to call it that, is moving to the direction of, you know, advice and, you know, employees making decisions. One of the biggest challenges of a leader in this world of work over the next 10 years is this. It's what level of empowerment are we going to do? And then how does my role actually change as a result of that? And if I was to really kind of think about, if I want to call it the kind of three mindsets that I think leaders need to really think about in this idea of the future work, I would probably summarize it on these three. And again, this is based on some leadership work we're doing at the moment. I think number one is this idea of holistic. So adopting a design-centered mindset and focusing always on going up and joining the dots wherever you can. So I think that's the first thing. How do I actually become a holistic design-centered leader? So that's one. I think the second thing is how do I deal with polarities? How do I deal with, you know, this idea of control and freedom? How can I deal with the idea of, you know, being a big organization but acting small and entrepreneurial? So how do I deal with these kind of new polarities that I need to think about? And there are ways to deal with those. And then I think the third one for me is this idea of circular, right? So thinking about this idea of everything as being circles of networks, also thinking about yourself as this regenerative circle, and also thinking about the idea of cradle to grave, right? You know, some people call it 100-year thinking. So thinking about the impact of your organization, what you do in a much more circular fashion. So kind of holistic, polarity, and circular, or I would say, are the kind of three mindsets that are important to leaders as they go into this idea of the future work, whilst also having one eye and the level of empowerment that makes sense to have in organizations to unleash things like hyper collaboration, you know, innovation, evolutionary strategy, and all this other kind of good stuff that you see in the books. And right at the core for me is this idea of polarity, and I think it's probably the most important thing, right? Because it's an interesting time for leaders, and if I was to sum it up, you know, how as a leader can I create this hyper efficient technology enabled organization while at the same time as growing a vibrant, living and human organism, right? Really, really interesting. How can I actually be a leader when everyone is a leader but no one is? Okay, these are questions that we've never really had to ask ourselves, you know, back in the day. So if everybody's empowered to lead, what does that do to leadership? So it's a really interesting question. It changes ultimately what this idea of leadership is about. And then being able to embrace the best of what's worked in the past while evolving into this more empowered future and still protecting the present, right? So these are the kind of, you know, different kind of challenges, stresses and tensions and polarities that are part of the debate, if we want to call it that, that we need to have in terms of the future work. I don't fundamentally believe that anybody's actually come up with the answers for these kind of new models of leadership yet, based on the work we're doing. But I think this is the opportunity for us to really think about that and adopt this more experimental mindset. So with that, guys, I'm going to kind of finish up on that. And I always like to kind of, first and foremost, let you recognize that first thing is that the future of work is something that you can design for your organization, right? It's something that you can consciously and purposely design. The second thing is that you need to think about the future work across these 3 Ws: workplace, workforce, work task. If you're only looking at one of those, you're not actually thinking in a holistic way, and you're going to actually miss these opportunities that are being afforded to us by this new kind of future of work world that we're living into. This idea of HTT, more human, more design, more tech-centered, you know, please keep those things in mind when you think about this idea of the future of work. And when we talk about one of those Ws, when we talk about this idea of workforce, we need to recognize a few things. Number one is that the very definition of what workforce is has changed ultimately and forever. Secondly, that it does have implications in terms of leadership. And then finally, you need to really think about some of those polarities, some of those tensions, and kind of what we're going to do about those into the future. So very simply, future work world, what's your design? Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, Barry. That was very informative, and really, even myself, I learned a lot there. So thank you. Now we do, as you can see, we are speaking here with an expert on this topic. So it is an opportunity to answer a few questions. We've got about 5 minutes left. So Barry, if I could just pick out one of the questions from Dermot Brown.
Yeah.
What does this future of work and greater remote working mean for the future shape and function of cities?
Brilliant question. I see we have an intelligent audience, so I'm probably going to kind of fall over here. I think, you know, first and foremost, genuinely, it's a brilliant question. And what I would say is we're kind of, for me, we're still straddling kind of the old world and new world on this, right? And I know obviously there's been some kind of new legislation in inverted commas kind of presented in Ireland over the last kind of last few days around kind of rural working, etc. I think it's going to have significant impact in terms of the role of cities and of urban areas, okay? And I think there is some good work done in the area, but not enough, right? So I think first and foremost, like the same way at an organization level, we're thinking about what is our future work design. I actually think we have to ask exactly the same question in terms of, you know, the design of our future cities, right? And it's going to have significant impact in terms of how we use physical assets, you know, within the city. It's going to have major implications in terms of infrastructure and the types of transport systems that we use, and all sorts of implications that, quite frankly, my brain is probably too small to kind of deal with all of those implications. But I do fundamentally believe that, you know, and that's why I call out society as part of our definition of the future of work, right? Because this is going to have major implications in terms of society. So I think it's a debate that's kind of, it's coming at it, and I think the most important thing for me, Dermot, is this idea of holistic again, right? I'm seeing lots of different kind of conversations about the city, right? One is around how do we make the sustainable city? The other one is how do we make a smart city? You know, there's all sorts of cities kind of floating around my head at this stage. And I think it's time for us to kind of step back and actually question what all those things holistically mean to the city, and how would we actually design a city that ticks all of those boxes as best as we can. So that's the big thing for me on this one. It's going to have significant implications. Secondly, we need to have a much more holistic, joined up way in terms of how we think about what a city is and what the function of a city is. And it's going to have major implications across all of those kind of core pillars of this idea of an urban environment. So hopefully within the time that I have, that's okay there. And please, and I should just say, Cliona, please, anybody that wants to interact with me on emails afterwards, please do so. I should probably guess I'm big into the network effect, so please do. Thanks, Dermot.
Okay, thank you, Barry. Actually, we have a few questions coming in. The next question is, I'm taking them in order of how I receive them. Do you think agile approach in the creation of solutions can be used to create the leadership space and collective decision making?
Brilliant question. Who's that from now? Just to make sure.
That's from Jocelyn Kervish.
Thanks,
Jocelyn is based in Rennes. So
I always worry with these kind of Q&As. Will I be found out? You know. So great question, Jocelyn. Yeah, look, I think here's the thing for me, right? Agile is an example of a work task methodology that focuses in on, you know, that more team-based, empowered approach. So for me, even if you park something like Agile and you put it in the context of Lean or Six Sigma approaches or more kind of empowered working approaches, that is definitely the direction of travel here. So for me, the toolkit of the future organization definitely looks more like that Agile, team-based, empowered approach. And what I would say about Agile, and one of the things we're seeing a lot of, you know, there's some organizations that are using it really well, but it's actually probably less well spread in terms of its use both across organizations but also in inter-organizations. What we generally find is that your kind of your kind of IT, you know, R&D areas are using Agile an awful lot, but then when you actually look at it across the business, it's very, very different pockets in terms of the level of maturity of those types of methodologies. And it comes back to the point I made earlier on, is what is the future work design that leaders are trying to create for their organization? So if they're kind of saying, okay, on the work task side, we are going to actually use tools that really empower people, right? And that should be more at a organizational level, because otherwise then you're into a situation where different parts of the organization, it's not about the methods, it's actually about the mindset, you know, in terms of how work gets done. It is very, very different. And that can lead to all sorts of challenges down the line. So I would say that in terms of the direction of travel, it's about that kind of broader based use of, you know, team empowerment type methodologies, which includes Agile, that kind of give people a greater sense of empowerment and a greater ownership in terms of the project. So great question, thank you.
Okay, Barry. Now, I think we're going to take two more questions, we might go over time a little, but for those of you, I hope you'll stay with us. This is from Margaret Slattery. So Margaret's the president of France Island Chamber of Commerce. And a brilliant presentation, Barry, very much appreciated on behalf of Margot. And how can inclusion play a part in this future world of work?
For me, inclusion is absolutely key, right? So if you think about everything really that I'm talking about, is that none of this can happen without what I would call deep network level inclusion. And you know, deep is an important word, and network level is really, really important. Again, if you really think about this idea of inclusion, we do have a tendency to think about it in terms of what I would call our core talent group. And there's lots of really fantastic work being done to kind of what I would really call drive out injustices of business, right? Let's be honest, right? So things like, you know, underrepresentation of female leadership is an injustice. Let's just sort that crap out, excuse my language. And anything else where people can't be themselves and have an equal playing field in terms of how they do that is just, for me, let's get that sorted, right? End of story. I think that deep word is an important word, right? Because deep is around, if we're going to create this much more inclusive environment, then the next question for me is, how do we actually get the most out of that inclusive environment? Okay, because there's a lot of studies out there that kind of highlight that absolutely a more diverse, you know, kind of group of people, you know, can kind of give us all sorts of advantages, but only in the context of them having the kind of right level of facilitation and the right level of mindset in terms of how things get done. So for me, the next big kind of frontier, if you want to call it that, of inclusiveness is, how do we have deep inclusiveness that properly embraces these different kind of mindsets that we've managed to kind of bring onto our organization, you know, from all sorts of places, right? And lots of different elements of diversity. I think then the second part of that is this network piece. So again, that network piece is very much around thinking about that overall network that you have in your business. We don't always have to worry about diversity just in our core talent group. We also need to think about the diversity of these other people that we work with, of these other types of organizations. So I always like to ask the question, how far away is, you know, one of your suppliers from your core business that really stretch you, right, in some shape or form? How many, for example, of your suppliers are from different nationalities, right, from different countries that have a very different way of doing business? All of these things become really important when we have this kind of conversation around inclusiveness. And I think, Margaret, you know, for me, inclusiveness is like the other side of the kind of collaboration, right? So for me, we cannot have this collaborative advantage without this kind of deep inclusiveness approach, but deep and at a network effect. So hopefully that kind of gives my own perspective on that.
Thank you very much, Barry. And I will come to our final question. It's also very interesting. This is from Paddy McDermott. And Paddy is actually the chairman of our working group for the CEOs.
Hi, Paddy.
So Paddy. So hi, Barry. Thanks for your presentation. Is there a danger that leadership actually becomes less specialized and thus gets lost, while understanding the need to see it as a priority to be managed?
Great question. Again,
yeah,
these questions are probably, you know, probably some of the best questions. I'm going to read it again here just to make sure I get on this. Yeah, I think, look, it's a really, really good question. Look, I'm a huge believer, Paddy, that look, leadership is absolutely, you know, a core set of skills, right? And I think sometimes we have a tendency to, you know, kind of underplay, you know, the impact of. I think it's more. I think what I would suggest is that what is changing in leadership, and I mean this in a totally interesting way, is that the color of leadership is changing. Okay, and it's a really important point that I'm making there. And I'm referring to colors in terms of the context of that organizational DNA strand that I kind of highlighted at the start of the presentation. So what I would suggest to you is that leadership will continue to be absolutely key. There'll be a key set of specialist skills, but actually those specialist skills may be evolving, right? So for example, how do you become, you know, what does it mean, right, to be more of an orchestrator of work? What does that actually mean? What are the skill sets that enable, you know, me to actually do that? What does that actually mean from a kind of a core skill set perspective? So in other words, orchestration will become an absolutely core skill of leadership, and some people naturally do that. So some of these zeitgeists that people naturally have in them. But the next question for me then is, okay, if orchestration is important for this new type of leadership, what are those specialist skills that we need to kind of work on? So I actually think that there might be a different hue on the skills and a different kind of way of looking at the specialized skills, but this idea of specialization will still absolutely be important. And I think the second thing for me then is this idea more of standing back from leadership. And I do like to say, Paddy, like we are on this kind of, you know, I always try to think about a picture, you know, if somebody straddling a, you know, a river, right? The straddle is really the important thing. How do I hold on to the good elements of what's worked over the last 50, 60 years in leadership, while supplementing with some of these kind of new ideas and new concepts? So if we really think about the future of leadership, and a number of people, you know, talk about this area, is this idea of integral leadership. So how do I combine all of the best things, you know, not leaving things behind, but all of the best things to create a new specialism? I think that's the really interesting debate for our leadership today.
Okay, Barry. Well, look, thank you very much. I think we've covered all the questions, and extremely interesting questions. I'd really like to thank all our members and guests for joining us today. That was very thought-provoking and so well presented, and thank you. And I'm glad to say that Barry has also agreed for this presentation to be recorded, so it will be available on our website very soon. And so Barry, all I can say is thank you very much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure listening. We could go on all day. I think there's so much to talk about about the future of work. So thank you.
You're very kind. Yeah, thanks, Kat, and thank you everybody for kind of, would you say, listening to me for droll on for 40 minutes or so. So thank you very much, guys, and thank you very much, Cliona, for inviting me along and all the great work that you guys are doing in the chamber. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bonne journée à tout le monde. Merci. Au revoir.